Welcome back to another lesson. Today we're talking about course objectives, institutional or programmatic outcomes, and alignment. Let's jump right into this lesson. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today are course objectives and institutional or programmatic outcomes. If you are on the week 2 resources page, like shown here on the screen, you will find that I have once again linked the objective versus outcomes document that was provided for you in week 1. So that's there to quickly reference back to, and we'll be talking about it in this lesson as we go into a little bit more detail about how to write good course objectives that are in alignment with your institutional outcomes. And then after that, we're going to talk about that alignment process in more detail so that you have a proper understanding of how to do your assignment for this week, but more importantly, how that helps you to organize your teaching, which helps your students organize their learning, which will be the topic for next week. So we're slowly building into this larger study of teaching and learning throughout this entire course as you're starting to piece it together from week to week. So let's start first with this objectives versus outcomes document. Now, as I mentioned, this was provided for you last week as a primer into choosing your topic in a way that was going to allow you to write objectives for your lesson plan that comes up in week 4. At that point, I made the distinction between a course objective or a lesson objective versus a programmatic or university level institutional outcome. I'm using the terminology that objective is a smaller, refined course level or lesson level type of goal, whereas the institutional, departmental, or programmatic outcome is going to be the loftier, larger view learning outcome that you would get after your degree. So think of it as, what are the things your students need to learn in your course or that individual class period? That's your objective. But those objectives then feed into a larger outcome that the university hopes that you will have achieved by the time you graduate. So imagine that all of your objectives are then mini objectives for the larger outcome. They feed into that larger outcome. Now, you might get objectives from several of your courses in your program, and all of those courses then come together to aggregate in order to help you achieve that larger outcome. And I'll break that down and show you how that works here in just a moment. But that's sort of the large scale view. Remember, the objectives are going to be at that course level, and then they fall under the category of what an institutional outcome would be. Let's take a closer look. So I also want to throw in this caveat that it's oftentimes confused, that sometimes other sources are going to basically switch these two phrases around, and they're going to call an outcome an objective or an objective and an outcome. And we'll see that in our next document, actually, in a resource that I provided you. So try to keep that straight in your mind. For the purpose of this class, remember the objectives that I'm using are for your course level or your lesson level, and the outcomes are those broader department, program, institutional level outcomes. When we look at learning objectives, let's define that. They are statements that specify what the learner is supposed to know by the time you complete your learning activity or the process. So in this case, the lesson that you're providing. They should be objective, measurable, action-oriented in order for your student to actually do something that you're setting out for them, in order to demonstrate that they've been able to achieve the learning that you have set forth for them. All right, so in order to come up with a learning objective that's both clear and effective, the student must be able to demonstrate the specific action that you're asking them to do. And this is why those action verbs are so important in this week's assignment. I'm going to pay special attention to the action verb that you're using because it needs to be demonstratable. And we'll discuss the difference between what's a demonstratable action verb versus what is less demonstratable or not demonstratable in just a moment. Also, that action must be measurable. So when you're thinking about your assessment for this week's assignment, and how you're going to assess what your objective is, when you're writing that objective, think, can I document what my student is doing? Can I measure it? How am I going to keep a record of that? Maybe it's a checklist or a clinical practice guideline or a competency checkoff. Maybe it's a recording. Lots of different ways to do this. Quizzes, tests, all of those essays, those all work. And we're going to learn a lot about that in our text this week, No Time to Teach, as you read through those pages that have been assigned. So make sure you're reading those pages before you jump into your assignment, because they're going to help guide you on some specific teaching techniques and methodologies for assessing your learner. So just like in the case that your action verb must be measurable, it also must be observable. So you should be able to see the result somehow. So this might be an active learning type of technique. Maybe it's a group discussion or some type of activity up at the board in your classroom, or it might be a document that they turn into you. So as long as it's observable and documentable and measurable, then we're able to have that student demonstrate what it is that they've learned. And then they've completed your action verb in your objective. Now, one more thing to consider. More often than not, a good learning objective is going to elicit higher levels of learning. So this is that concept of abstraction that we discussed last week, in that the higher levels of learning you're capable of achieving, the more abstract your learning becomes. So think about Bloom's taxonomy when we are going up each individual level there, and that your action verbs should be aligning somewhere with one of those levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, remember, if we're starting at the very bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, usually there we're just like memorization types of skills or simply identifying types of skills. And those things are okay for introductory objectives at the beginning of a course or at the beginning of teaching a concept. But ultimately, we want to see those objectives elevate along with our teaching, along with the students' learning, as we move into the material that we're teaching and as they become closer to mastering the topic that we're teaching about. Now, before we move on to the next topic here in this lesson, I want to spend one more minute on the importance of the action verb. And this is so important because if we get this wrong, then our students are completely confused and they don't understand what they're supposed to be doing in order to demonstrate achievement in your course. They're not going to understand what it is they need to do to prove to you that they've learned. So therefore, your assessment and your action verb must be closely aligned. And we're going to talk about this concept of alignment in more detail in just a moment. But just think about that from a 30,000 foot view for a second. If I have an action verb in my objective, I need to make sure that through along all of my teaching, that when I come to assess my student on that topic, that they've been able to demonstrate that they can actually achieve that thing that I set them out to do. So the action verb starts the process, the assessment finishes it. So if I have an assessment that is not accurately measuring my action verb, then I don't have alignment, and my learners are not going to be able to demonstrate what they've done because I've not been clear in my teaching of what they've actually needed to do versus what I'm going to assess them on. So that alignment between action verb and assessment are very, very important. And that's what this assignment really helps us to get figured out and solidified in order to organize your teaching in a way that is going to make you an excellent educator for those students. So when it comes to those action verbs, there's a few that you want to avoid altogether. And I've listed a few of those here. And you want to avoid those action verbs because they're really ambiguous to the learner and they're not going to be able to clearly understand what you're asking them to do. So take, for example, if you're telling the student that they need to have learned something. Okay, well, what does that actually mean? How do I demonstrate that I've learned something? So in your assessment, you're going to come up with a very specific activity for them to do in order for them to demonstrate that they've learned something. So instead of just telling them that they have to learn it, look at your assessment of how you're going to assess that learning, and then try to align that assessment with a more accurate action verb. If the student's supposed to become aware of something, again, very ambiguous, understand, and also the verb know, K-N-O-W, know, that they should know something or that they should understand something. Again, how are you going to measure that? How are you going to measure that they know this? How are you going to measure that they've understood the concept? Well, you might be thinking, well, that's easy. I'm going to have them take a quiz or have them, do a simulation, and that's going to demonstrate to me that they understand it or that they know it. And that is true. But think about it. If you're asking them to demonstrate it either verbally or in a written exam or in a simulation, then use those more specific action verbs in your objective in order so that the student coming into it understands what they need to be able to achieve in order to fulfill the assessment and therefore the objective. Don't make it so ambiguous from the objective to the assessment that they don't know what they're supposed to do. So I mentioned that this kind of links to Bloom's taxonomy a little bit. So let's take a quick look at how that can be played out. So here we have Bloom's taxonomy, of course, from the bottom up, and some action verbs that are listed here according to each level of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, in the assignment, you're going to see that I've listed this out in a little bit broader categories. We're not going to drill down quite so deep, and you don't always have to do that in your course either once you are teaching full-time. But this just kind of gives you a good idea of where we're at in those levels of learning, or that learning hierarchy, those levels of learning abstraction, as we move from the bottom layer here of Bloom's taxonomy up to the top. So at the lowest level, we've got the types of things where we want the student to be able to demonstrate their knowledge of something, right? And so instead of just saying they should know this, that, or the other thing that we're trying to teach them, here's some really good action verbs that are going to line up with this introductory low level of learning that we're wanting our students to demonstrate. So things like defining, memorizing, repeating, matching, recording, printing it out, telling, recounting it, citing it. Those are all really, really basic learning activities. And so therefore these action verbs are going to indicate the student exactly what they need to do. Now, the alignment aspect comes in where in your assessment, you're actually going to produce some type of activity that allows your student to demonstrate their ability to do these exact things. And now, as we move up the Bloom's taxonomy level, moving down this chart here, we're seeing we're going into higher levels of learning, higher levels of abstraction. And as we get to that point, we're seeing that the higher level of learning, it's an analysis or a synthesis, an evaluation. So it's not just a memorizing or an application type of thing, but it's actually taking multiple streams of knowledge, adding them all together, and then coming out with something that requires the addition of all of those learning moments together in order to demonstrate that they've understood the process in that way. And so then we start coming up with some of these other action verbs. So such as compose, right? If we want them to write a paper on the synthesis of 3 different research journals, then that is going to be a way for us to see if they've been able to do that. Other action verbs you can see here are listed, and some of them are going to be very specific to an assessment, whereas others, you're going to have to be a little bit more creative, and that's where our text for the week comes into play, is how am I going to be able to assess this student on this type of action verb as we get to those higher levels of learning. And that's why this course is called Teaching Techniques, because we're going to provide you with some ideas for how you can do that. At the lower levels, it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward to come up with a documentable and achievable assessment. But as we really start getting higher and higher into those levels, it becomes more challenging. And therefore, your skills as a teacher really start to shine because you get to demonstrate how you're going to create this assessment to make sure your students are able to achieve those higher levels of learning. We're almost finished here, but let's jump into this course alignment document really quickly. And here's a good example of what I was mentioning before. Now in this document, they're using this term course outcomes in the way that I'm using the term objectives. So keep that in mind. Don't get confused by that. Remember here, I'm saying that the objectives are those course or lesson level related issues that are statements of the general knowledge and skills of your student. Whereas the institutional, again, program, department, university level types of outcomes, and again here they're using the term objective, but I'm using outcomes in this case. They are the broader skills and learning that all students should have upon graduation or completion of that program, department, institution, university, you name it. So see how the objectives are specific details that ultimately feed into the higher category of the institutional outcome. And this is kind of where we jump into a more specific discussion of alignment. Every learning point that you teach about specifically in your course is going to, or should at least, fall under a higher category that the institution has put forth in order for you to come away with. Now, one class isn't going to teach you everything you need to know about that higher level outcome. But if you start adding together multiple classes where you've learned about, for example, critical thinking in 3 different classes, now you might not be able to achieve that from one class, but after you put all 3 together, by the time you graduate, the institution says you should be qualified in critical thinking. Not because you passed one exam or you did one assignment in a certain class, but because you synthesize all of that knowledge that you gained throughout the program, through multiple classes, in order to create this ability to think abstractly about critical thinking in order to demonstrate that. So once again, we see that this is what is called alignment. And alignment is necessary to make sure that we are teaching the individual specific items that are going to fulfill the university's goal for sending you out, the things that you need to be prepared with before you can get your diploma. So as a way to demonstrate this alignment process a little bit further, let's quickly look at this week's assignment. Now, I overview this assignment in more detail in another lesson, so I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to use this as an example. So here we see that we've got this nice chart set up for you where we've got one column with the objectives, we have one column for the institutional outcomes, another column for the learning level or the type of learning that we're trying to achieve, and then we have a column for the assessment tool. Now, the course objective is, of course, important. We've talked about the action verb and the different items that you need to include in that to be specifically telling your student what they need to be able to achieve as far as their learning. Now, if you scroll down, I've listed here 3 different learning levels and some basic action verbs that go along with that. So if we come up here, we see we've got this type of learning or learning level. And we want to make sure that this is aligned. The course objective, the action verb, has to fall in line with the type or level of learning that we're wanting to provide. So let's say that one of your course objectives is to have the students list the normal values for a blood gas. Well, because we're having them list it, it's basically a memorization type of function that they're learning. And thus it's at that lower level of learning. It's that lower level of Bloom's taxonomy. So it's an introductory level of learning. And we'll see that some of the good action verbs for an introductory level would be to list it, to name something, to identify it, or to recall it. So just again, in that sort of broad category of the first couple levels of Bloom's taxonomy, you've got this introductory area. Now the next level would be the reinforcement area. Now here we're asking the students to do a little bit more than just to demonstrate a general memorization knowledge of the topic that we've provided them. We actually want them to be able to take that information and start to do something with it. For example, how to reason and solve problems via the information that they're now able to synthesize together. So that is a reinforcement level because we're reinforcing the previous knowledge that we've given them. Now that's really good, right? That tells the student what they need to be able to do in general, but it doesn't tell them what the assessment actually looks like that they're going to have to do. That's where this other column up here, the assessment tool, comes to place. So now you can see we're taking a course objective. We have to have a good action verb that is going to be at the level of the learning type that we want the student to be able to achieve. And then our assessment tool is going to be the specific activity that the student does in order to demonstrate that they've been able to complete this objective at that learning level. And that's where the alignment comes in. Now we talked previously about the institutional outcome. If we scroll down a little bit further, we'll see a list of institutional outcomes that I've given you. And the first one here is critical thinking, then we have communication and professionalism. And most institutions have, 6, 7, 8 of these, but for our purposes in our course, we're just going to stick with these 3. And so the first one here is critical thinking, and you can see I've given you a definition for what critical thinking is, some outcomes of what that would look like. What does our student have to have in order to demonstrate that they can fill that definition of critical thinking? And then some examples of learning experiences that we can use to assess their ability to critical think. So what I'm asking then for you is to align your course objective with one of those institutional outcomes. So in this case, identifying the signs of an asthma exacerbation is falling under the institutional outcome of critical thinking. And so this very specific objective is helping us to further achieve an institutional outcome. It might not do it all at once, but over the course of several programs, several semesters, a couple of years perhaps, you are going to leave the institution with a synthesized ability to critical think as demonstrated in individual courses because we provided you that information and that ability at a step-by-step level slowly along the way of the entire program. Now, as you continue to move through your teaching, you're going to want to continue to build on knowledge throughout your course. And so that's when you're going to start looking at these reinforcement levels and emphasis levels of learning. And of course, when you do that here in this column, you're going to provide an action verb in the course objectives column that is in alignment at that proper learning level. Then you will tell me in the assessment level the exact precise thing that the student needs to do. And of course, all of that, then you'll have to decide, well, what institutional outcome does that fit under? It needs to be categorized under one of those institutional categories. Now, I'll make one more note about the assessment column here before we end this lesson. And that is that you want to make sure that in this column, you're providing a specific demonstratable, observable, and documentable activity for your student in order to demonstrate that they have achieved that objective. It also needs to allow you to, of course, document it and record it for your own grading purposes, but in many cases also to be able to give back to the student to further enhance their knowledge. So one area that tends to be problematic with this assessment area is when we start looking at really active learning engagements, like things like simulation, group discussions, board work. You send your student to the board to write something down, or some type of verbal assessment, because those things are really hard to document. We can see them, we can observe them, right? But they're not like turning in a quiz or a paper that we can keep for record as documentation of their work. It's things that are easily seen or observed, but not necessarily documented. So think about that. I'm not telling you not to use those. In fact, I think you should. They're fantastic assessments. But think about how you're going to document those activities. And what I always recommend is using some kind of checklist while you're in class. If their students are verbalizing something, that you can go ahead and check each student off that they've verbalized it. Or if they've gone to the board, you can do that with a checklist. If you're in simulation, you can use a clinical practice guideline or a simulation competency checklist so that as you're observing them, you can check them off, and then you have that record enabled to keep of their demonstration of that objective. And so that's a really easy way around some of those harder to document types of assessments. All right, thank you for joining me for this lesson on objectives, outcomes, and course alignment. I hope that it really helped you to sort of package all of that together and organize it in a way that understands the concept that we're going for, along with the resources that were provided for you within the course shell. Make sure you're consuming that along with these videos. Make sure you watch the video about this week's assignment as well, as it's going to help you build out that knowledge on the alignment of the objectives, the outcomes, and of course, the assessment of those. That's all for now. Make this a great week.